Good afternoon again, everybody. My name is Martin Bratschi. I work for Vital Strategies, and I'll be chairing this session on digital innovation. What I plan to do is just give a very brief overview or some key points that I think are relevant for this discussion, and then we have a very rich panel here to present and hopefully have time for a discussion at the end. So just if you bear with me these introductory points that I think are relevant for digital innovation in the field of CRVS. And I'll just make three points that I hope we can also discuss in the course of the panel during the discussion. There. Okay. So the first point is that digitization is really not an option. I think in this day and age, we can all agree that civil registration records, at least at the central level, must be digital, and there must be use of information and communication technology for CRVS systems. However, as we all know, there are many risks associated with that. For example, data security. We heard just in the previous panel inside here about data leaking out to the public and then individuals being identified and getting harassed. So there's definitely big risks with that, and those need to be mitigated. So that's the first point, that really digitization is not an option, so we need to deal with it appropriately, and we need to digitize. The second point is for solutions, we need to look for solutions that are scalable and sustainable. And I was trying to look for a good illustrative image of this, and I couldn't really find a very good one. But this is my computer in rural Cameroon, and there's a little USB modem sticking in the side of it, and you can pretty much get internet everywhere in the world now. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you should build solutions that depend on the internet, because even though you can get it everywhere in the world, it's still fragile, or it'll only work at times. So we need to make sure that we don't, through digitization or innovative digital solutions, create barriers to access. Also, of course, in particular relevant for us here, to the registration of birth and death. And along the same lines, we need to make sure that the innovative system developments are fit for purpose, which may mean in some settings that actually the initial few kilometers of the data transmission can be on paper, and it doesn't need to be digital all the way from the source. And then the third point and final point that I'll make here as part of the introduction is that digitization is an occasion, and it must come together with overall system improvements. And I won't read the quote, but there's a quote here from the Digitization Guidebook that says that digitization is the point where there's a massive system overhaul. So this needs to go together with other system improvements, and it shouldn't just be digitization of the status quo with all the flaws that this may have. This in turn means that the digitization, because it's CRVS and because there are these many stakeholders involved, all those stakeholders will need to be consulted in the course of that digitization effort. And digitization should be combined with other system improvement tools and measures. So in particular here, some things that come to mind is that this can be an occasion for a review of the legal framework, which probably there needs to be such a review anyways, so that digital records are even acceptable for the CRVS system. There should be a review of business processes so that it's not a flawed system that just gets digitized. And it's an occasion to ensure that the CRVS system complies with international recommendations, and of course the little logo there is for the principles and recommendations of the UNSD. So with that, I have also listed here a few questions which maybe we can just get to at the end for discussion if need be, depending on how much other questions we get. So with that, I'd like to come to the panelists and just briefly introduce the speakers before they start with their presentation. The first presentation will be by Murodillo, who's an independent management consultant specialized in ICT. Over the past decade, he has extensively contributed to the design, development, and implementation of digital CRVS systems, of a digital CRVS system in Tajikistan. He holds a PhD in information system from the University of Oslo. As the next speaker, we'll have Jane Thomason, who's the CEO of Apt Associates in Australia, who is leading major development programs funded by the Australian government in Indonesia, PNG, and other countries in the Pacific. She has, over the last 30 years, extensive experience in working on problems of poverty and inequality in the developing countries, is a global expert in blockchain, and holds a PhD from the University of Queensland. We'll then have a presentation from Claudine Henry-Anguna, who is the Registrar of the High Courts at the Ministry of Justice in the Cook Islands, who works on strengthening CRVS in her own jurisdictions, as well as in the region, in neighboring countries in the Pacific. She's also the co-chair of the Pacific Civil Registrar Network, a member of the Regional Steering Group at SCAP, and has a degree from Auckland University in New Zealand. And finally, we'll have a presentation by Dakota Gruener, who is the Executive Director of ID 2020. And at ID 2020, she is leading the overall strategy, building critical partnerships, and focusing on ensuring that the organization stays on track of reaching the goal of reaching every girl in the world with an ID. She has previously worked at Gavi and holds a double degree in biology and political science. So with that, I would like to ask Murod to give our first presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. First of all, I would like to thank IDRC for the invitation and making it possible for me to attend this important event, to share our experience on the integration of DHIS2 with the CRVS system of Tajikistan. Maybe many of us know that DHIS is a system for the management of the health information system. It can hold the semi-aggregated and aggregated data on health, on various health data. And it already has a vital statistics part of the CRVS on it. So many data could be already there. Thank you. Paper-based system of the civil registry of Tajikistan is marked to be satisfactory in terms of the completeness and accuracy of the registration of the vital events. We register 7 types of vital events. This is a birth, death, marriage, divorce, filiation, adoption. Civil registry system has 68 district offices, and all of the municipalities which comes under the districts also have a mandate to register 4 types of the vital events. This is a birth, marriage, death, and filiation. Municipalities at the end of the month report to the district civil registry office on the number of the registrations they have made. Civil registry system of Tajikistan has an adequate content, capacity, and the practice, dissemination, and use of the data on vital statistics, but automation, integration, and use of the system is ranked as inadequate because on a paper-based system, everything is done manually, and the coding of the ICD-10 and other fields that are needed for the statistical purposes are done by hand. And this will delay on up to 1 year of statistics to be prepared for the decision making. Development and implementation of civil registry system, electronic civil registry system of the Tajikistan started as a part of or subcomponent of the health management system project, which started in 2012. Before this, 2 phases of the health management system were carried on, and then only on 2012, a subcomponent of the health civil registry system started within the project of health management system, because at that stage, the design of the project was based on the Health Metric Network framework, which has a CRVS component on demographics. When we started to design the civil registry system, many debates were on the different levels of the management, with some uncertainties if this could work or not. Availability of the infrastructure, acceptance by the end users, and lack of experience in the CRVS implementation in the neighboring countries or in a similar context in the world. The system was developed and implemented using the DHIS system as an installed base. DHIS is used in many developing countries as a health management information system. And Tajikistan has a good basis to take it as a good example of a successful implementation of the information system. And we have many developers and users who are successfully using the system. And the decision was that we can extend this system to build a national civil registry system. The other consideration to use the DHIS was that it is an open source, because when you start to implement something, you have to decide on the infrastructure where you have to implement the system. If you are going into proprietary applications, then you have to make a strict decision if you go for that or you don't go, and you make another choices. But with open source, you are free, because you don't have to have a one-time decision, and you can at any point make a decision whether to improve the infrastructure or make the application to fit within the existing infrastructure that exists. The other important thing that we did during the implementation was that collaboration of the interagency was improved. The Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Health, National Statistics Office were organized in a working group, and we had a very good collaboration and discussion where the ownership of the system was recognized by the Ministry of Justice, and also the collaboration with Statistics Office, who were interested in the coding of the each event, which was automated in the system which we developed, was one of the achievements to boost this interagency collaboration. At this time, the system runs on its own. It's separated from the health system and is owned by the Ministry of Justice. And each district can cover their incurring costs on a monthly cost. Here you can see the process of the design decisions and the implementation process. At the first box, you see that we get the DHIS as entry point. And at the national level, we decide how we should localize the system to match the needs of Tajikistan. And then the decision goes into the district level, where they can take the actions with the decision made. And then the feedback will come in the terms of incentives. If the users are satisfied with the system, they can report that this functionality is good and they can go with it. And it's positive, we get it into the system and put into infrastructure, and it becomes institutionalized through the course of the daily work they do. If it's a negative, and then we reconsider it, or we just cancel that procedure and it won't be included into the system. And through this process of try and failure, we try to get the best of the decisions made to be included into the system. We also use the different standardization approaches to get the global into the local context, and then how to draw the patterns of the use cases that could be used at the different levels. Like when we started to register a birth, and there was no one single birth. There are many cases of the birth, like it could be a single mother, it could be a stillborn, it could be a found child, it could be abandoned child. So many different cases of the births were presented. And we found it through the course of piloting the system, and then the users have reported that because we have validation on all of the cells of the system, when it's a single mother, and then the system complains that the fields for the father are not filled in. But actually, it should be empty because there's no father. It's a single mother case. So we had to deal all of these minor things that are specific to this particular birth registrations. And the similar pattern was drawn from the different vital event types. And their similarities were matched to make another decision, like for the birth and death and marriage, we have certain fields that are very common to all of this type of vital events. Here I'm giving the facets of information infrastructure as a basis to assess the availability and possibility of implementing civil registry system into the context of Tajikistan, and we divide it into 4 distinct types. It's a data-related, what data is available there, and what data we need for the decision-making. And ICT-related is about what the physical infrastructure is there. Is it networking available at all the points that we have to access this data? Policy-related, at this point, we check if there are enough legislative basis for making this, and to what extent it allows us to deal with the personal data. And capacity-related is whether the Civil Registry Office has a capacity to run such a system. And these facets of infrastructure could be used as a framework to assess readiness of the context for implementing electronic CRVS. Information infrastructure also carries an institutions. And for this, we have to bring together fragmented institutions like Statistics Office, Civil Registry itself, healthcare. And then we have to get all this member organization to come to a common decision, what is useful for the system for them. While the first and the second points are contradictory, where we get one entire whole and then we look inside at the different facets of the infrastructure. At the second point, we want to bring fragmented institution into one. During the implementation, we try to emulate the software artifacts into a format that it's transparent to the end user. So the many of the features that we implemented into the system were very transparent. It's for them like if they were working with a paper-based system as before. But at the background, there were many things going on that was not known to them. Like the system was coding, all statistical codes were placed into each field where it was required. And we used also a topology of the standardization during the course of design and development of the system, which I'll be talking next. standardization as a generification, and similar process or habits that we have discovered through the course of the implementation, we brought into one standard and separated it that it could be used at a different points when it's needed. Standardization as a localization, we got those features which were already implemented into the DHIS system to be used within the civil registry system as a well-known solution that is already there. Like DHIS has a very sophisticated administrative division management functionality that shows a hierarchy of the national, then provincial, down to the districts. So we use this feature as a indicator of the addresses for the different vital events. And the system was designed in a way that it was user-centric. And like if we know which municipality this case is to be registered, we just select a municipality, and the way up to national, it would be automatically filled in. So the user does not have to select the country, province, etc. down there, but it just selects the lowest address, and at the top of it gets filled in. And the same approach was used in many other different cases. Like if you want to register a marriage, we just try to search a name of that person, and the system will find him through his birth registry and fills up almost 80% of the form. And the same could be done for the other party, and it's just a few fields that have to be filled in. At the time of registering the birth, it's the same. If the parents are already in the system, one could search for the name of one of the parents, and when the system finds it, and then the specialist verifies that this is that case, and it just clicks that name, and the form gets filled like 90%. So the system goes, if we search for the wife, it gets her husband's data, fills in all his fields, and it goes, finds their marriage certificate, and places all of this. And it kind of reduces like 40 minutes of time for the manual registration. So they have to go to the archive, find their marriage certificate if they didn't present it, and they have to manually write this in 2 copies. Because Civil Registry of Tajikistan has 2 hard copies. One is kept within the Civil Registry Office, and the other one is sent to Statistics Office as a backup for the storage. So this kind of decisions and design approach was throughout the system for all 7 types of vital events that helps the CRO specialists to reduce their time for the filling in the forms. It was a kind of incentives for them that they started to support and take ownership of the system, because it's dramatically reduces even the typing, not only handwriting, but also the typing of this. And the motto was that write once and use from there on. You don't have to type it again all the way. So it's not just a simple registry of the cases, but it's a semantically designed system that brings the data whenever you want and also follows the real-life situation of relationship between the people. The way we go forward with the system, and all of these vital events are registered within the birth certificate. So the birth registration is a primary, and then any event that comes after this is linked to that particular case. And having this, we can have a tree of the families showing who belongs to whom, and different relationships could be discovered from this. And this could be a valuable source of analysis, finding many different patterns in the people's behaviors and the way of living. This is the centralized database, shows at the right on the red manual reporting, and on the green you can see that different administrative divisions have access to the same database. They can access the data from different districts, while on the paper base they have to either make a phone call or find the person to get his copy of his other certificate. But in an electronic format, it's just easy for them. But in order to this to be implemented, there's a need to change the legislative basis that can allow one district to look at the other district's data, which is not. At present, all 68 districts are connected to the central database. We use the intranet. It's out of internet. It's a local VPN connections that can run even if there's no internet. It can internally run, and it also reduces the cost of the data connectivity between the nodes. 340 CRO specialists have been trained. Many of them were new to using this computer technologies, and they've gone to the basic computer courses as well. The institutions that belongs to the Ministry of Justice for post-qualification development developed a curriculum and training materials for using the CRO information system based on DHIS2. One of the other big challenges that made the system accepted by the government was that the use of the digital signatures and then PKI infrastructure. PKI infrastructure is a way that the certificate authority will issue the certificate for each node and also for the server. And they can, at any point of time, to verify who is communicating with them. If any client requests to the server will ask him for the certificate, and only after the justification, the communication would be possible within two systems. And it uses very high and secure links upon the agreement of the security and authentication. And I'm running out of time, but yeah. At this time, Tajikistan wants to link all of its foreign consular representations with the existing system using the VPN, that any vital events that happens for its citizens abroad can be registered through this system, even abroad. But the key recommendation for using or building the information system is for the civil registry system is to make it useful for the general public. Like currently, there is a limited local use of the system. It's closed. It's not distributed among the other public agencies within the country. Few incentives for the population to come and register in time. And there is a limited information sharing between the state agencies. At the operational level, we should take the holistic approach, as I shown the information infrastructure facets, that the various aspects of the information system should be taken into consideration, because information system is not just the software and the hardware that runs, but it's a combination of people, norms, and various facets of the infrastructure that in common become an information system for the use. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. I think it's a very interesting case of a digital CRVS system being developed. Jane, please.
Thank you. For those of you who don't know me, for 3 years I was the global focal point for CRVS under the Commission of Accountability for Women's and Children's Health, and I helped convene the first global summit on CRVS in 2014 in Bangkok. But I'm not a blockchain expert, just want to stand my chairman corrected. But I bought a blockchain expert. I'd like to introduce you to Kyle Kemper, who's head of the Canadian Blockchain Association. But I have been researching and investigating blockchain and its applications for social impact in emerging economies for the last couple of years. I want to do two things in this presentation. I want to make you think, and I want you to get excited about the possibilities that blockchain and other disruptive technologies can be for CRVS. If I can... Down. Okay. So I was kind of going to talk about Indonesia and PNG, and to some extent I am, but the key point that I really want to emphasise to you from this slide is in Indonesia 61% of people are unregistered, but in some provinces of the country 91% of people are unregistered. In Papua New Guinea 98% are unregistered. So the scale of the problem in hard-to-reach countries hasn't changed. And I'm not sure that our way of solving the problem has changed either. But this is today. We need to kind of wake up and understand that these things are already taking place. Machine-to-machine communications, high-speed analytics, digital identity, self-sovereign identity, gamification of training and education, everything, drones and self-driving cars, digital currencies, 3D printing, intelligent electronic agents, smartphones and tablets are our primary source of data and communication. Advanced automation and robotics and rapid growth of big data. This is today. This is not next year, 5 years' time, 10 years' time. We need to wake up and say, how can we leverage this to solve the same problems that we've been trying to solve for many years? Digital identity actually could be a game changer here. So you know all the reasons why identity is important, and I'm actually not even going to present this slide because we've heard it 46 times today. But I just want to focus on a few things and talk to you about a project that we've... Oh, now it's driving itself too fast. But you know these things. 1.1 billion people have no identity. And one of the greatest issues in terms of equality is women's access to funds. 2 billion people are unbanked. We can't talk about identity without talking about the things that identity confers. This has got the better of me, the technology today. So... It's working really fast, so let me... Okay, that's the end of the presentation. Okay, is someone driving this, or is it's out of control? Can someone control the slides other than me?
Yeah, I can do it if you'd like some help.
Yeah, I really think I need some. Can just go through...
Is the receiver here? Oh, okay.
It's the presentation in a blockchain.
Yeah, that's the problem, isn't it?
Where do you want to go?
Next slide. Not next one. Next one. Okay, so so people in the bottom billion, you know this. They haven't got smartphones. It's still going.
It's jumping. Yeah.
Can we control it up the back, please?
I'll keep flicking it back.
Okay. So they don't have smartphones, they don't have electricity, they don't have internet. If we're going to solve those problems, we need to be able to solve that problem. So, no,
Yeah, this is easier.
okay.
You cannot.
Okay, I did that. Okay, so the other... Yeah? She's fixing it. I'll just go next slide. Yeah? Okay. No, can we go back to that slide we were on?
I love this presentation. We're excited.
It's fantastic. I wanted you to be excited and think, listen, I'm just giving up on the presentation. Okay, so the point... No, not this slide. I hate that slide.
This one. Stay here.
No, I like that slide, but that's not the one we want. We want the microgrid power trading.
Too much technology can give you this kind of problem.
I know. Can we go on to the one that's the microgrid, please, the solar power one?
You wanted this to be exciting.
I know. Well, you know, it's exciting. Anyway, the point that I want to make about the microgrid power trading, and you may or may not be aware of it, but with the cost of batteries and solar going down and the capacities of the blockchain, which, watch this, fast, secure, efficient, transparent. No, you missed the last one. And immutable. Okay, but this is a big one. No internet, no electricity, and only using a 2G mobile phone. You can make these kinds of solutions. They love that slide. What's going on? These solutions can actually work for the bottom billion. So one thing that I'm not going to show you today, because I can't get the slide, has been made on a 3D printer. It's that little orange device. Do you think you can try and get on the slide with the orange device and just stay there? I'll just talk about... If you want the slideshow, I'll send it to you and you can do it at your own pace.
This one.
This one. Yay! So this is a proof of concept that we've been working on for the past year. This is a working prototype. Now, what this device will do, it will allow you to take a biometric identity. We're using a fingerprint, but it doesn't have to be a fingerprint. Hash it up onto the blockchain, creating a unique identity for a person. It can also send and receive digital money, and it can also allow the owner of the box to trade microgrid solar power. So what it means is if you're in the village and you're the shop owner and you have one of these boxes, you're going to be able to take and record identities, you're going to be able to send and receive digital cash, and you're going to be able to sell energy, because this is powered. This doesn't need internet, it doesn't need electricity, and it can be done using a 2G mobile phone. So if you think of the population of the world who have access, don't have access to smartphones but do have access to 2G mobile phones, this is a solution that can work for them. We actually showed this a couple of weeks ago. We were shortlisted to take it to UN Women. They had a kind of humanitarian lab and interested in solutions that potentially could be used in refugee situations. So, as I said, this is a prototype, and this is demonstrating, you know, 3 of the ways that blockchain is going to potentially change the lives of remote and difficult to reach populations. Because if you think about this, it's sort of like a service ATM coming to the village. Instead of the villagers, as they have always had to do, leaving the village to go to the urban centre to be able to work or get into the cash economy, this allows them to participate in the cash economy in the village. And for many countries that rely on remittances, which you'd all be very well aware, first of all, this allows immediate transmission of a remittance. So we were in New York sending a remittance to a person in Papua New Guinea in 3 seconds, and they were receiving the remittance. So it was a live demo. In the village where we tested this, people have to walk, catch a bus, pay 60 kina to go to the city to get a remittance that's been sent to them from somewhere, take a day to pick it up, then get another bus home. So if they had 200 kina, they might pocket 50 by the time they get home. So we'll just go on to the last slide. The point that I really want to make to you is not to say this box is the solution to everything and blockchain's the solution to everything, but what I've been doing for the last 2 years is really trying to understand the technology, review its applications, see where it's already being used in developing countries, and there are use cases in refugee populations, which we heard about this morning. A number of countries in Africa are using it, a number of countries in Asia. Learning about what the applications are and thinking about how we can use it to solve these age-old problems that we've been struggling with for many, many, many years. I hope you enjoyed that very lively presentation.
Great, yeah, thank you very much. Claudine, please.
Can we get it up to... Sorry, thank you. Hopefully we don't go driving everywhere else. Kia ora, I'm Claudine. I'm from the Cook Islands, Ministry of Justice. Whoops, let's turn this on first. Claudine from the Cook Islands. Now, I'm going to be speaking to you about some of the great work the Pacific Civil Registrars Network has been doing in terms of different projects, and one of the priority projects has been in terms of data sharing between countries. Now, hang on. Okay. So who are we? The Pacific Civil Registrars Network was formed in 2014, and the members include about 22 countries, 14 states from across the Pacific. Associate membership also includes 21 relevant partner agencies and business, including key UN organisations. And this network basically gives the Pacific nations, including New Zealand and Australia, opportunities to meet and discuss the goals set by the countries as part of the our CRVS decade. Now, our vision has been noted as by that date, we will, across the Pacific, work together in ways that are flexible to local needs with a shared approach to legislative change, enabling technology and data exchange. And so, again, data exchange is the topic that I will be focusing on today. For those who are not familiar with the Pacific region, a lot of our people born in the islands in the Pacific, but we tend to move across to the bigger countries, New Zealand, Australia. And so often we have issues in terms of our people being born in the islands, but then they die everywhere else but the islands. So we have challenges in terms of trying to capture what has happened with that record. So over the years, conversations have been had with New Zealand and other members in the region, and so we recognised that we needed to start. I think we've just reached that point in time that we needed to start collecting the record. And again, as Jane said and others have said already throughout the conference, we know the reason why we need to do these things in terms of policy planning, national priorities, etc. So the Cook Islands and New Zealand were able to have a conversation and trying to put together an agreement. And again, it was just to be able to try and close off an identity, which we've not been able to do at all. Now, so what are the reasons for the movement of our people between islands to the bigger country? And there are many. Medical treatment, we don't have the facilities or services that the bigger countries have. So with our relationship with New Zealand, we're able to move our peoples across the way thereby, whether it's medical, referral or private decision-making to go across for medical treatment. Many educational opportunities, the jobs, the career advancements also are in the bigger countries. Our Pacific people love our sports, so there's a lot of attraction to go across to the bigger country for the various contracts. And climate change, you would have heard through different Pacific regions, the typical sort of issues that's arising from all these natural disasters and just changes in the world, really. And ultimately, because a lot of our people have moved across to the bigger nations back in the 60s or earlier. So, we've got this really tight kinship thing within the Pacific people that we always need to be together. So that could be another reason for the movement. So, you take all the likes of these sort of peoples that's moved across, we potentially have lost any record of what's happened to them. So, and I've got some stats here, but unfortunately it's not as current to date, but still relevant regardless of age of stats. And it just gives an example of the movement between different island regions to the bigger countries. For example, Samoa, the people in Samoa, there's about 50,000 people that was born in Samoa, and there's about there were about 50,000 that were born but are now living in New Zealand. And for those who passed in NZ, there's about 430-odd records or events that do not filter back to the island of Samoa, for example. So we have a lot of those sort of issues happening across the region, really. And that presented the opportunities for the Pacific Network to look at the sharing of data information between the relevant jurisdictions, obviously. And again, it covers all the issues that impacts any country with policy preparations and all those priorities. And so, in terms of the agreement between the New Zealand government and Cook Islands, we signed an agreement in 2016. Just to explain, the Cook Islands has a special relationship with New Zealand, and that although we're self-governed, we still have a free association with New Zealand. So we actually carry New Zealand national passports. Our currency are the same. They are New Zealand Māori. We are Cook Islands Māori. Language is quite similar in terms of the native language. And our currency are the same as well. So we have dual sort of currency. There are only 2 other islands in the region that carry that similar sort of distinction. That's Niue and Tupelo. So when we started to look at how can we best share the data, we obviously needed to look at the legal framework. Now, New Zealand currently has provision to enable sharing of data, and the 2 main parts that we were focusing on was death information as well as name change. Unfortunately for us in the Cook Islands, yeah, we've got the regulations there, just tells us about the procedures, etc., but it's silent in terms of the sharing of data between countries. So the purpose of this particular agreement was to be able to share data so that we could positively identify persons, and it's a matter of matching and updating records, update our birth records where notification of death has occurred in New Zealand. That's extremely important for our people in the Cook Islands because previous presenter next door talked about incentives. We have succession land court matters where you can succeed to land unless, of course, you can prove that there has been a death and you can succeed to that person's titles. So we have a lot of incentives back home that our persons who may not even been born in the Cook Islands, for instance, can come back and claim land. So there's a lot of things that can be done with the completion of record as well. Updating birth records of persons with name changes. The Pacifica people, I don't know, it may well be the same elsewhere, but we just have this thing about having so many variation of names. A single person could have an entire story. You know, it's a very, very, very long name, but it's actually telling a story about the history of how and where they came from, the ancestors, etc. And, you know, you may be legally registered as one name, but you end up dying with somebody who, my goodness, you just have no idea who that person was. The names seem to change over time, but it's not legally changed, registered. So we would like to hear from New Zealand whenever any of our people have changed their names for the obvious reasons. It's election year this year, so, you know, a lot of them will be wanting to make sure that they are indeed on the roll, but we want to be sure they are the right match as well. And it's, again, for the usual statistical analyses, informations, and our genealogical reasons. Families are extremely important for us. Ancestry is extremely important to us. We need to know who and where we come from. And I do understand that because of the agreement we've set up with New Zealand, a lot of the other islands in the region have become quite excited. And they too have been in discussion. I think New Zealand and Niue have perhaps since signed an agreement. And I understand New Zealand, together with the New South Wales Registrar Office, have also signed agreements. But that's for New Zealand persons who are now in Australia. So, and it's starting to extend into other jurisdictions as well. So it's working extremely well for us. And at the end of the day, New Zealand's systems are well in advance from the Cook Islands, but we claim that our system is just as good because it works for us. So, you know, we could be at different levels in terms of the technology, but the purpose of what we're trying to achieve here, we are able to do it. And you know, it's extremely important that we are able to share data. At the very beginning, it was a difficult issue for a lot of the persons in the region. A lot of people are quite territorial over their data for whatever reason. I mean, at the end of the day, it may well be because it's not in order. But, I mean, that's the best way to be able to check that we can get these things accurately set up. So, anyway, that's data sharing from me and the Pacific Network. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Dakota, please, last presentation.
Great. So I have the dubious honor of being the last person on the presentation here, so I will try and keep this short, but also the benefit of having gone after a full day of presentations, so lots of things that I can kind of quickly blaze through. I guess first, a thanks to the IDRC, to UNICEF, others for organizing the conference here, and Martin for facilitating this discussion. So I guess a few things. I would like to pick up on two of the sort of challenges issued by Haishan in her presentation this morning. I think the first was saying, be provocative. And the second was saying, how can we sort of reimagine the paradigm of identity, the paradigm of digital identity, and think about that both as it relates to CRVS, but also as it relates to the digital economy and to sort of broader services and social protections. So in the course of this presentation, I will zoom out a little bit from CRVS, even actually from the view of digital identity related to solely how one interacts with their government, and think about digital identity from a sort of full life cycle perspective. And I think one thing that Claudine's presentation just raised that I'd like to touch upon is this importance of portability, right? Individuals move, lives sort of follow all sorts of different paths. And so thinking about how portability is an important theme. If I can figure out how to use this way, that one. Okay, so I won't belabor this slide because I think we've seen something similar in almost every presentation today. But essentially, we all know this. Identity is necessary to access important services, political, social, economic opportunities throughout life. This is just a small subset of the various different relevant moments that someone may need to prove who they are. And as Jonathan said this morning, this is really all about trust. How do people believe that you are who you say you are and that you should have access to the services that you should have access to? And without verifiable credentials, without that trust, individuals are often invisible. They're unable to access healthcare, open a bank account, receive an education, vote, sort of any of the things along this continuum. They may even bear a higher risk for trafficking. And then without the accurate population data, and again, I think this is what brings a lot of us here to the room. Certainly this is what initially brought my own sort of attention to this issue. The public and private organizations that are trying to reach these individuals and broadly deliver services efficiently and to those who deserve them struggle to do so. And, has been repeated many times throughout the course of the day, with credit to the World Bank for their work to pull together this data. We have 1.1 billion people globally who are unable to prove their identity. Just important, and I think you guys know this, 625 million of those are under 14, and 230 million are children under the age of 5. So, this is how this ties back to CRVS specifically. But I'd like to put forward the belief that universally systems of digital identity frustrate users, businesses, civil society, and governments, right? So there are 1.1 billion for whom they have no form of trusted identification. I think across the board, all of us are saying that as we try and prove who we are, both in the digital and physical world, we're really struggling to do so. There's too much personal data stored in all sorts of different silos. For the businesses who sort of sit on top of that data or the governments who do so, doing that is toxic, right? There's cybersecurity risks that they're really, really genuinely scared of, and for very good reason. The user experience is terrible. I mean, all of us can think about the 1,000 usernames and passwords that we try and navigate constantly, and what that does is damage trust kind of across the board. And so what I'd argue, and what I'd put out as sort of the central thesis of really the entire presentation, is that there's a really interesting and powerful opportunity around a convergence of need, where sort of both in many of the settings that we're talking about here over the course of this conference, but also sort of in settings like Ottawa, there is need for new models of digital identity, and there's lots of conversations ongoing. I see Tim here in the front row, who's busy working on what a Canadian answer to this could look like, and in that there's a huge opportunity to ensure that as new models of digital identity are being developed in the private sector, are being developed in governments, such as the Canadian or the U.S. or whomever it may be, that work is not just isolated to countries with resources, right? That we are not creating a gap in the adoption of relevant and important technologies, that we're not creating two different sets of technologies that preferentially serve the needs of those in sort of wealthy countries. And so I think the really important thing is saying, how do we harness new and emerging technologies, and how do we do so in a way that as these technologies are being developed, because we're right at sort of the vanguard right now, that we're injecting the needs of the people that we're talking about here into that conversation. And what I think is really important is that there's a couple lenses that we can think about that from, and I'll kind of get back to this later in the day. But for any individual organization, the question is, how do we improve service delivery, right? It's how do we improve the relationships that we have with the individuals that we're trying to serve, and that's a question of how we do things at low cost, in context appropriate ways, quick to use, intuitive for the individuals who are trying to use it. importantly, that it's unique to the person so that we can actually be sure that it's, who it is we're trying to serve. But there's also a really, really important question of, and I maybe should even put this first, of individual empowerment and protection, right? How do we ensure that people have portability, that they can move between different places and continue to prove who they are, that there's persistence, that from birth to death they have the ability to prove who they are. And I think perhaps most importantly that it's privacy protecting, that individuals have discretion over how that information is shared, with whom, such that they aren't exposed to sort of greater risk because they have this digital identity. And then I think tied into that is then the questions of how you then link to the sort of collective ecosystem of different stakeholders in various different ways, because what we're trying to do is essentially say that there's capacity strengthening that's required across the board. So this is a bit of just a brief reversal and to talk about terminology. And I can actually maybe skip through this really quickly, but I think just one really important thing. The USAID report that came out, I think it was probably late last year, is one that I'd really encourage everybody to read if you haven't already. I think it's really fantastic. And one of the things that they call out is that, for many of us who spend a lot of time thinking about digital identity, we talk a lot about functional and foundational identity. And what the USAID report argues is that perhaps that's one lens, but perhaps a more useful lens would be thinking about, the sort of infrastructural and instrumental approaches. So that, instrumental being something where we design, a digital identity system with a purpose limited to a single project. And these are, sort of often functional registries, but, the notion is saying that we are trying to solve for the problem, of a voter roll for a specific election, and we're going to implement something that's sort of time limited and confined to that moment in time. Whereas infrastructural would be, how do we lay the infrastructure that can be used for many different things? And so designed with a number of stakeholders involved, using open source platforms, open standards, compatible with many different local systems on which things then can subsequently be built. And important to note that this could be either functional or foundational. I think this is sort of where the terms get a little blurry. But I think this is sort of an important construct for me as I think about this. So just sort of the focus on how do we build infrastructural systems. And not to belabor the point, but I think that one of the reasons that we sort of sit in this room is that historic investments in instrumental approaches have created a bit of a market failure, right? As we've put money and investments into programs to fund very specific use cases, whether that's birth registration or voter registration or registration specifically of a single population, we encourage the organizations who are working in that space to build a system for that specific use case. And so you end up without the interoperability that we desire. You don't have that portability, and you don't have the persistence. And so, it's a bit of a challenge to everybody in the room. I think that one of the things that's an opportunity, but also sort of a current limitation, is that we've funded investments in the sort of instrumental approach historically. So with that, I think the problem is it's not technology, and it's not even delivery. I think in many cases, this is a market failure, and that becomes a really important point of leverage in thinking about how we can change this moving forward. So to kind of go back to the points I was making earlier, digital identity, and I prefaced, I think that first clause is really, really important if implemented thoughtfully. If implemented thoughtfully, digital ID can empower individuals and can serve as this important development infrastructure. These are some of the points I laid out earlier, but I think it's really important that we think about how it's personal and how it's portable, and design that into sort of the basis of the system. And with that, what you can then do is sort of bolster all of the various different services that come on top. So whether that's tracking of vaccinations through a digital child health card, financial inclusion, social protection, any number of various different things, or strengthening CRVS, right? Being able to identify those who sort of slip between the CRVS registration gaps and sort of reverse enroll them in CRVS. It's a really important thing that we kind of think about this as that fundamental infrastructure. But that said, and this is the reason for that first clause, many ID-related risks, mass surveillance, data breaches, identity theft can be heightened by digital identity. And it's really, therefore, critical that we think through the design and implementation of these systems incredibly thoughtfully. I think it's important that we take an eyes wide open approach because there are real risks. And I think as we implement things, really important that we're thinking about what those risks are. So I guess what we've seen, and this is in conversations with sort of private sector companies working at the vanguard, with organizations like TIMS and others who are thinking about digital identity in all sorts of different contexts, is that there's really sort of a new paradigm around digital identity we see emerging. And if historically, and this is the graphic's really, really hard to read, but if sort of currently right now we have siloed and very non-portable identities, right? We are a spoke on however many different wheels, and that data then sits with, whether it's your bank or your, whomever. There's a vision at the moment of how you could move into a sort of portable and more user-centric model where you then sit as the nexus between the different services that you're trying to provide. And this is where, some folks are quite excited about blockchain technology as the potential to do this. I don't want to go too deep into the technical kind of underpinnings there. I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. But, a very, very brief sort of synopsis of, I think, why it is that people think it could be valuable is that it facilitates decentralization with trust. So if right now, there's a challenge where you can either have, sort of a centralized repository of information that serves as sort of the ultimate source of the truth. That requires first there being that rolled up, sort of information, which requires sort of a known set of all the different actors to participate in that. But it also then creates sort of a pretty staggering, sort of cybersecurity risk, or could create a sort of staggering cybersecurity risk. In a sort of blockchain-based world, individuals could sort of serve as that unit of interoperability. So, they could have a private key, and even I think this is important to say, even in settings where you're working in very low connectivity, there are ways to do this that would be sort of smartphone, that aren't reliant on a smartphone, aren't reliant on many of the kind of high-tech tools that you may use. The individual would be able to, move between multiple different organizations and in a verifiable way say, I am who I say I am, right? So you could share information from your interaction with one agency with another, and you would have the ability to sort of selectively and granularly control how that information was used. So this differs, I think, quite drastically from some of the sort of centralized and, even federated models that have been explored historically. And importantly, I think going back to the principles I described earlier, what it does is it gives individuals control and autonomy of how their identity is used across multiple different authorities. It facilitates that portability that we were just, we're talking about. And it, at the end of the day, it really, I think, goes back to what I find really important, that identity should be a fundamental human right? The ability to sort of claim I am who I say I am, it feels to me like something that should be fundamental. And yet, if there is if there's a reliance on any single institution to do that, there's always the possibility that right is taken away. So again, happy to answer kind of questions on what the technical bit. Didn't want to kind of sidetrack the conversation. This is really messy, but tries to describe a little bit of what that could look like in practice. Again, I can send you guys the slides. I think you guys had access to it over the course of the conference. But this sort of shows what that could look like in practice. And what I think is really important about this is that this then allows you to think through, sort of multiple different entry points as a mechanism to build coverage and scale. So if you have sort of agreement on some basic, sort of technical standards around, an open source and open standards-based approach for how you would provide that interoperability, it allows you to have the sort of patchwork type approach where people can access access and create a digital identity for themselves through multiple different organizations, and do so particularly, I think, with the organizations that they trust. And so what that does is you could imagine different settings where you could use various different entry points. The example I use here, and this is one that I drew from my previous work at Gavi, but there are many other countries that we're thinking about, particularly over the course of this conference, where immunization rates are much higher than birth registration rates. And that, to me, seems like an opportunity, right? If children are receiving, even one dose of a vaccine, they're often provided with a child health card at that moment. And, that is in some ways actually a much more ubiquitous form of a child identification document than, the formal civil registration documents that children, the birth certificates that children should get. And yet we don't sort of have, those are paper-based. We don't have a way to sort of prompt a child being registered with the CRVS authority after receiving a vaccination. And yet if we can kind of, again, invert this model a little bit so that people can collect, a digital identity and associate that with multiple different claims from different organizations, you can imagine a world where as they receive the digital child health card, that could then prompt the creation of a birth certificate. And, so what we're doing, and I don't want this to be about us, but is, bringing together, organizations, both public and private, each of whom are thinking about this from very different lenses, and trying to ensure that we take the, the sort of newest thinking around technology, but make sure that's contextually appropriate, while thinking through, what are the various different entry points, and how can we layer on those in a really creative way to reach scale. And so I think particularly around CRVS, how can you work with the likes of Gavi and others to see growth in birth registration rates, subsequently in death registration rates or other important moments around CRVS through a really sort of creative and ecosystem-based approach. That's, I think, the last slide. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much for all the presentations and contributions. So we have just over 15 minutes for discussion. Please, maybe if you can come to the mic.
Oh.
There's one.
Do I need a microphone? Oh, yes, I do. Sorry. Oh, that means I have to.
You have a soft voice anyway.
No, I don't have a soft voice. I have very good projection, Jonathan Maskell. Thank you. It's like being home, right? Listen to all these Australian accents. Are we in Canada, really? No, we're in the Cook Islands. This is, maybe it's a question, but really more of a reflection. And I'm going to look at my WHO and UNICEF colleagues here as I say this. There is a real transition in the way we're thinking about identity and the way that digital approaches are thinking about identity. And you said it, and I think Jane alluded to it as well. And it's about person-controlled identity, right? And in health, it's about person-controlled records. And so I understand the principles of this, and I actually agree with the principles of this, right? I think a person should have the right to manage their own identity. One of the things I think that we should look at, though, I'm not going to say have an issue with, I'm going to say we need to explore it, is that this has a particular implication for data. How do we measure anything if people are just giving us the rights to use their data on an ad hoc basis or on an individual basis? So, example, health. How do we manage or measure, some of our population health concerns where we've got an opt-in situation, right? Which we're not used to this. So I just want to draw your attention to it because I know that sometimes at these things we have a real thing where people say, person-controlled identity, and then it doesn't happen. I actually think it is going to happen, and I think it's going to turn on its head how we look at, measure our outcomes, look at our health outcomes. And I think if we don't start to think about it now, we won't. It's not a question. I'm not going to end this with a question, just a statement. But yeah, really, I think it's an important thing that we need to really consider because it's going to impact even on, how we measure our SDGs. How do we measure birth registration if we have systems where people are opting in and they're babies? That doesn't work in my head. But yeah, I think it's a really fundamental shift that we're having. We have a whole notion, this whole conference has been about centralised control of identity, getting it into government systems, pulling it all together, measuring it. I actually don't think we're facing that situation anymore. And so on one hand, I think that's great. And on the other hand, I think, oh my God, how do we do health? Yeah.
Please come to our blockchain lab tomorrow and we'll be able to explore that.
But I would posit that I actually think that this will be less disruptive in that regard than perhaps you're suggesting. In that I think I don't think that sort of a user controlled or sort of portable identity is incompatible with sort of systems of national registry, right? I think that they are actually quite complementary. It's individuals are sort of serving as the unit of interoperability, and so as they interact with multiple institutions, being able to log those with the various different institutions, to be able to collect attestations from the organizations with whom they're interacting, and to be able to carry those with them as they move, between institutions. But I don't think there's any suggestion that the organizations themselves are going to, sort of just suddenly not have access to data, right? I mean, if you are for the sort of birth registration example that you were providing, I think the birth, the CRVS, whatever the, ministry mandated with CRVS in a particular country will continue to issue birth certificates. And I would hope that they do so because it's a really, really important legal document. What I do think will change is that the data perhaps that the next organization with which a child interacts with, maybe there may be less data stored there, right? Because they can say, I can refer to the attestation issued by this, and sort of digitally signed by the CRVS authority, and therefore I don't need to collect a huge quantity of data. I may have the sort of, it may provide the necessary threshold of information. I may have a record of that person as they interact with my specific institution, right? Your bank is going to have the information of how you interact with the bank. Your mobile network operator is going to have the information of how you interact with the mobile network operator. What I think you just won't see is the people collecting sort of extraneous data to them. Is that?
Yeah, I think we've got some big shifts with GDP.
Yeah.
The EU and that, which
yeah.
also present the same problem. So, anyway, just a thought.
Yeah. No, I think it's a really important point. But, Dakota, as you're saying, it's complementary, and you need that civil registration at the beginning, and that will provide for the vital statistics. And then the individual has more freedom to opt in or out of systems that follow. Okay, let's take a few more questions, please, with the mic.
I'm just going to reinforce the refreshing message of having the individual at the center of this, because I've been listening to the whole conference. This is probably the first session where that's really been emphasized. I come more from the health IT, EMR space and struggling with the challenges of integrating the data in those contexts, and more so being able to share information and what, the challenges, the legal challenges, the security, privacy, et cetera. And what we're finding, I'll put in a plug for Canada. I'm based here in Toronto. In the Hamilton region, we've been working with personally controlled health records for about 7 or 8 years now, in sort of more research and development mode. And also a plug for the U.S. Veterans Administration, which has been doing this for equally longer, if not longer. And what we're seeing is that empowerment of the individual creates the integration point where it really belongs, which is the person. And they can decide, who to share information with easily, more flexibly. So in VA, for example, there's a thing called Blue Button. You can download a snapshot of your medical record as a PDF or an electronic file. You can take it and share it with anyone you want. What's been happening recently is the ability to actually then, there's another facility where you can actually share that data for clinical research, and it can be in a completely anonymized form. So there's some really interesting paradigm shifts that happen, and a lot of the barriers that we've encountered in many different levels, especially privacy, security, et cetera, that kind of just melt away when you empower a person with their own information. So I think that would translate into identity. There's a symbiotic relationship between that and everything you've been talking about. And that's been our experience. It's really exciting because it really is transformative.
Thank you. Please, can you use so the people.
Thank you. Very exciting presentations, least of which is Jane's. But I think there are some fundamental shifts happening in terms of merging of identities. In China, we see WeChat as the identity, right? You can do everything with WeChat. Maybe that is the civil registration in China, I don't know. But in Bangladesh, what we're seeing is also the merger of biometric identity, financial identity, and communication identity. So we are seeing already connection between SIM cards and national ID, which is biometrically verified. We're now working on creating a financial address for every citizen so that first we'll start with social safety net payments, and then it'll actually expand to all kinds of payments. So potentially in near future, we'll have at birth a unique ID, a mobile phone number, and a financial address given to an individual, so that you can have all kinds of ID. Maybe it'll be one handle, a Twitter handle or something that'll map to anything else, potentially. So that's the future, not too far distant. Thank you.
Hi, folks. Niall from UNDP. There's one element of the person-controlled identity data issue that I'm really, really struggling with internally in my own head. I can't get my head around it. And this is this idea that whereas I completely agree personally that somebody should have the ability to control what state agencies, or indeed what private sector bodies, what elements of my official identity they get to interact with according to their mandate. I get that. I'm in favour of that. I'm in favour of the idea that there's certain elements of someone's identity that is extremely important to them that they feel the state should recognise, such as, for example, the ability of transgender people to be able to change how their sex is recorded in state documents. But there's other elements of identity or variables of someone's identity I'm not sure somebody should be able to change or tell the state, I want this changed and I want you to respect the fact that I control my own identity data. Date of birth is one of those. Me deciding to, I don't identify as somebody who was born in September. I was actually born in January 1972. Please, I want my pension now. I want my pension now and not in 5 years' time when I'm eligible for it. I don't think I should be able to do that. And the principle there then is that there are elements of your identity that the government has the right to tell you, you are who we say you are and not who you say you are. There are some elements of that. And I don't know where the boundary is. But I do, when I hear us constantly talk about person-controlled identity, it's something that naturally we will go, yes, this is excellent. But there have to be limits to it. And what are the principles that we agree are the limits, or what are the boundaries? This, I don't know if you or anyone else has some thoughts on this.
Do you want to respond to the question, or?
No, I want to add to the question.
Sorry, I was going to ask.
I want to add to the question from a child's perspective. A child that doesn't have agency and would not be able to control his or her identity until a certain point, and how the state have to protect it, right? And we always in child protection have this issue of when does the state come in and when does the parent lose their right, and when does the child have to state their right. Another thing is actually, it came out in your point, okay? We always talk about the legal and policy framework, and it came out in your point, but one of the things we're concerned about is all these new technologies do not seem to invest in looking at what are the regulatory framework, right? So the poor CIVS people are left looking at trying to run after you to see what's the legislative framework. I feel if we're introducing new technology, the burden on these which have really better resourced than the CIVS should be proven the concept within a regulatory framework. How does this fit within a regulatory framework? And what would it require, right, for this technology to have the right balance of a person directing and owning their own identity, and the state's responsibility, their public health responsibility, their safety responsibility, their all kinds security responsibility. If a security person was here and he hears you guys talking, he's going to become really upset, about some of these issues, right? Because they have to have certain control at a certain point. But I also believe we should have the balance. So my point is we should invest in the regulatory, and if we can talk about that.
Yeah, very important point. And we only have 3 minutes left, but maybe we can. Well, I know, but we don't want to miss the reception. But maybe we can use that last point and just go through the panel again quickly. And what is with regards to the regulatory framework, what is your experience with these innovations? Like how much attention has been paid to the regulatory framework, and how big are the changes required to make the regulatory framework align with these new technology, which I agree, they're all coming. As Jane says, they're here now. So we have to deal with them, but we're still also constrained with the regulatory framework at the same time. So maybe we can just go through just 1 minute each, and then that's, yeah.
In my country, we use two types of ID. One is linked to the person that goes with him, and the other one is a document which has an ID that links to the person. Like I get a birth certificate which is already numbered, and it goes until I lost it and I get a new one. I get with a new ID. So this could be a solution for the personal identity. I mean, if I'm given the ID, which belongs to the paper, not to me, but the paper belongs to me, then at some point I can change this ID in case it's needed. Yeah.
So just a couple of things. One is a number of countries, including Canada, have regulatory sandboxes, and so that means that you can test and trial the technology within, a well-observed space. So I'd say that that's important. But the other thing, and I really want to talk to everyone in the room, is get involved. If you think this is a technology that can change things, but you're worried about the risks of it, then get engaged in it. And donors spend loads of money all around the world doing all sorts of things that we know don't work. So just put a little bit of money into trying to figure out whether something transformative could actually have the impact that we think it could.
Thank you. It's really interesting talking about this issue because it wasn't until the network formed and we then realised how very, very different all our regulations, etc., were, and quite antiquated. And so we had a whole lot of issues that needed to be raised. So a whole lot of this work was rapidly moving, but all things regulations are extremely slow, And so, I mean, it was a good thing too, because it just meant that, we needed to shift our priorities and trying to have that match the pace of everything else that's moving along as well. So, yeah, we were quite pretty much confronted by all of that. And I just think it's always a great challenge when we come across something that we've never been faced with before, and now we've got to move with it and try and make it work. So that's my take on it. Thank you.
I would echo what Jane said on both fronts. I think the regulatory sandboxes are a really important tool to understand sort of the regulatory environment and to learn. And I think her point around let's get involved, right? And let's understand how this could work. I think the one additional piece I'd actually add is that I think actually a lot of this, particularly in Europe, has been prompted by GDPR, right? So GDPR is actually encouraging people thinking about this sort of user-owned model. So in that case, it's an interesting one where, the regulatory environment is actually driving technology. On sort of Niall, to quickly get back to your point, I think that when we talk about this sort of self-owned digital identity, what's important is remember it's essentially a hanger on which to hang lots of different attestations or claims from different organizations, right? So, you'd be able to say, here is the claim the attestation provided to me by the national, registry. Here is the one provided to me by my university. Here's the one provided to me by my employer. Here's the one provided to me by my mom. And presumably, if you're then trying to share that information with somebody, and you share here's what Dakota's mom claims about her birth date. Well, in that case, actually, you may trust what the mom claims because it's probably exactly what was put into the National Registry in the first place. But if it was here's what Dakota's high school best friend claims about her birth date, you wouldn't, right? You would then say the attestation provided by the Civil Registration Authority is the one that I see as definitive in this one. I think it's a point that all of these, anytime you assess sort of a a piece of information provided by somebody, you're doing a risk calculation in that. And so you're sort of judging, to what degree do I trust the institution who's backing up the information somebody's presenting. And so, with pieces like this, you'd say I'd want a sort of different level of assurance, or I'd want to trust only select institutions. And then on the point around children, I think in many ways that actually it's not dissimilar from the conversations we're already having around when do we register children independently, or when do we think of them as sort of. And so while I think this may bring the conversation back to light, I think it's not it's not a brand new conversation. Right?
Great, thank you. Annika, just
last very quick comment. Yeah. So this is actually a working conference, right? It's not a talk fest. You might be surprised by that. So we're actually looking at the end of this conference for important pieces that we need to take forward. And I'm going to say I think this is one of them. I've just talked to Cornelius, who happened to be sitting next to me, so I can say with confidence that me, from Canada IDRC perspective, and Cornelius, we think that we should propose a little bit of work around this emerging theme, because I think it's kind of fundamental. It's not really, it is about digital, but it's about identity. And we think it's important we have some work done in this area. So just so you know that we're going to take the lively conversation and shake it a bit more.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you very much. And thank you all for your contribution. And I think we head over to the plenary again. Thank you.